Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out how people live. I'm also one measly credit short of an Associate of Arts degree in music and got an A in music history, so I like that part too. The music you're listening to in the background is by a local boy named Luigi Boccherini. Lucca is a lovely town located only 90 minutes or so from Florence, which made it perfect for a day trip. It's also something of a lucky city, at least in my opinion. It suffered through 20 years of fascist dictatorship, 3 years of war. Nazi violence came to an end on September 5, 1944. The Germans partially withdrew. The Allies entered the gates. Lucca avoided the bombs and street fighting that could have destroyed it, and did destroy so many other areas. Unfortunately, although the Nazis left, they engaged in what can only be called an aggressive retreat, much as they had in Florence. Dozens of Wehrmacht snipers hidden in the bell towers, inside and outside the city, in houses, and in the football stadium, mercilessly shot citizens celebrating the liberation or guarding the city gates. Many died then, others died while hiding in the hills outside the city. Lucca remains today as it was then and during the Renaissance, and even during Roman imperial times, a haven for art, architecture, culture, and music. The image you see here is of Luigi himself, complete with his cello. With all of that, let's dig into some history, Roman, Renaissance, and more modern, in this completely walkable and attractive city, today on The Armchair Traveler. If you've traveled with me for a while, you have already guessed that I'm always interested in the Roman-era underpinnings of modern cities in Europe. When I think of Roman settlements, large construction projects always come first to mind. Fortified walls, an amphitheater, perhaps a Roman theater, public works like a forum, baths, and basilicas. In the days of empire, these were where you did your business and lived your lives. Your first sight of Lucca as you head out of the train station is a sturdy city wall, but these were built in the Middle Ages. The red area outlined on the map shows us the line of the Roman walls, much smaller than the modern city. Notice the amphitheater, that's the red circle, was outside the Roman wall line. Even in the days of empire, however, the city was expanding. The much larger enclosed area you see here shows us the Renaissance-era walls today. These circle much of the town and are a real tourist draw. These are more than 3 miles long, and many visitors, though sadly, not including me, climb up and walk the distance. They're built outside the site of the earlier Roman construction, possibly with materials scavenged from the earlier walls. Sadly, almost no sign of those walls is visible today. Every Roman city of any stature had a forum, a central meeting place, market, and site for government. Lucca was no exception, and although the original forum has completely disappeared, we can still find its footprint. As the Roman Empire crumbled, the thrifty Lucans did what all people who continued living in formerly colonized areas did. They mined the already quarried stone and built their own homes, official buildings, and walls. Hardly anything from ancient Rome survives. This Google Earth photograph shows what appears to be at least a partly vacant square and shows us the basic shape of the former Roman Forum. In the Roman era, it would have been surrounded by public buildings. Today, the center of what had been the Forum is occupied by San Michele in Foro, and the name gives away the game as the site of the former Roman Forum. Now and then, the square is lined with commercial buildings, including the Palazzo Pretorio, shown in the photograph here. The Palazzo is a Renaissance-era building dating from the 1370s and practically brand new compared with the Roman underpinnings. It's also a courthouse. There's a Baroque-era clock here that still works, visible in this photograph, and a loggia, the porch with arches, that is still used for public events. The Church of San Michele in Foro is a church, not a cathedral, despite its design and prominent location. There has been a church here, although not this one, since around 800 AD. Its successor dated from 1070, and it was a rebuilding of the older church. What we don't know is whether this was the site of the ancient Roman basilica. It was common for those large, sturdy buildings, designed to house local government and the courts, to be converted into churches in the Christian era. The facade you see here was originally designed in the 13th century. It has an obvious false face, designed, rather like towns in the American Old West, to make it look grander, and I think it succeeds. The piazza in front of it is a going forum to this day, lined with shops, restaurants, and bars. The decorations on the church changed quite a bit as you move from bottom upward and from the side to the front. On the side, you can see a series of identical, mostly blind arches. The facing material might be white marble, but I'm not sure. Look upward one level and you'll see a second, smaller row of arches, again identical to one another, but backed up with the same kind of striping that we see in other cathedrals, especially in Pisa. Then move to the front and you'll see yet another row of arches on the bottom, this time more heavily decorated. The real shift comes as you look upward to what I think of as the false front. Here you see 4 rows of arches, the top 3 clearly leading nowhere, with multicolored pillars and backed with gray or green. The grime meant that neither my eyes nor my camera could distinguish the difference, but with distinct obvious pink or rose columns. Remember this odd design element because we'll see it again a bit later in our walk. The church is topped with a statue of its namesake, St. Michael, showing him clearly here in this close-up with his sword and killing the dragon. Lucca boasts the remains of an Imperial Roman amphitheater. There's a handy street sign here that you can just see on the left telling you that you're on Amphitheater Street. The street itself, however, is quite narrow, as are most medieval streets, so it's not obvious as you walk along until you get quite close and can see the people walking inside the perimeter that there's a huge curve here. The amphitheater lives on today as a huge piazza surrounded by shops and apartment buildings. From what I have read, all the marble that had been used to face the original building was recycled in the Middle Ages, mostly into churches, some of which we're going to visit today, but I imagine some of it made it into private hands as well. On the left, you can see the top of the curving row of buildings. These buildings date from the Renaissance and were built where the amphitheater seats must have been. On the right, Google Earth makes the form clear. The lovely piazza you see here is the floor of the former amphitheater. It's a quite attractive meeting place filled with moms out with their babies, older people chatting, and a wide variety of outdoor bars and restaurants. Each one of those umbrellas you see to the left is associated with a shop, and most of them were decorated with flowers. I have to confess I pretty much tripped over this one, and when I did, and found out what it was on my map, I still had no idea who this person might be, except that he was obviously a saint and had a church named in his honor. I found out his name was Saint Frigian, although they call him Frediano here in Lucca. The church was rebuilt in the 12th century, and when you come upon it from the apse inn and see the bell tower, you think, well, that's interesting, but you wonder why you made a detour. Notice the alternating striped material on the apse end of the building. The real eye-popper of the decoration is a splendid Byzantine-appearing mosaic above the main entry. You might expect it to depict a famous scene from the life of this saint, but it doesn't. It shows us the ascension of Jesus into heaven. I've often told you that I was raised in the Protestant tradition, so I'm no good at all with saints. I had absolutely no idea who this Saint Fredian might be, nor had I ever heard of him before or since. But I have to say he does have a really nifty church named in his honor. The real name was Saint Frigian. It turns out that St. Freddy was an Irishman, possibly a prince. The royal connection always makes these things a little more interesting, and the Irish do seem to have gotten around. He made a pilgrimage to Rome and became a hermit somewhere between here and Pisa. Now I have to tell you, there are about 1 million hermits and most of them don't get this treatment. So why were the good people of Lucca so happy to adopt this man? Well, the story goes like this. Fredianus, or Freddy as I call him, became known for working miracles, and his most famous one is a real pip. There's a river that runs to this day north of the city called the Serchio. In the old days, it would jump its bank and flood the city. The citizens got so upset by this that they called on their local bishop, a guy named Fredianus, to fix it. He went out with a rake, walked along the riverbank, and strengthened by the prayers of the faithful, commanded the waters of the river to follow his rake. To the amazement of those gathered, the river did as it was told. This is St. Martin's Cathedral. You get your first glimpse of this very large church as you're walking into town from the railroad station. Even from a distance and partially masked off by those stuccoed buildings, you can see the bicolored bell tower, which made a very nice landmark. Construction began in 1063, and the apse and the bell tower are actually original to the building. The view becomes far more interesting once you walk around to the front. This building is quite old. It was rebuilt in the 11th century, and there are newer sections that date from the 13th to 15th centuries. It resembles the Duomo in Pisa and is said to be a combined Pisa Romanesque Lucan style. The front, as you can see, is not symmetrical. I never did find out why. Perhaps the faithful ran out of money, or maybe space, which would be at a premium downtown, or possibly both. The facade is faced with green, white, and pink marble, just like the cathedral in Florence. The green was pretty grimy and read as gray to my camera in the distance shot, but in this close-up you can see the lovely pink. Even more curious is the fact that the upper columns on the facade don't match. There's a legend that the Lucans had a contest to see who would win the contract for this, couldn't pick a single winner, and so apparently let every contestant design one. There's quite a bit more to see on the inside, so we're going to make a stop here. The inside of the cathedral is mostly Gothic, as you can see by the vaulted ceiling over the nave. There are many more features of interest here in the interior. There's actually quite a bit to see inside the cathedral, and more than enough to make it worth the euros that they charge you for admission. The first thing that caught my eye was this marble inlay floor. I found out it probably dates from the late 1400s, and it's supposed to represent the Judgment of Solomon. The second thing I saw was the original of the statue of San Martino, who I know as St. Martin of Tours, and to whom the cathedral is dedicated. Martin is best known as a former military man and for the account of his using his sword to cut his cloak in two, to give half to a beggar clad only in rags in the depth of winter, which is what he's shown doing here. There's a copy of this on the front facade. The next thing I saw was the tomb of Ilaria of Coreto. Ilaria was the second wife of Paolo of Lucca and apparently extraordinarily beautiful. She was a member of the Guinigi family. We'll see the tower to this former palace in our next stop. When she died, Paolo commissioned a lovely and quite lifelike tomb for her, which you can see here. I found her face to be quite beautiful. Finally, there's Tintoretto's Last Supper, one of many that he painted, and he's one of several old masters to be found here in the cathedral. The Tempietto and the figure within are why people like me come inside and pay the fee to look around. It's called the Tempietto, or Little Temple. This is a 15th century structure designed to house something much older, although probably not as old as the legend would have us believe. The statue within is called the Holy Vision. The story behind it is pretty confusing, but the best I can figure goes like this. After Christ was crucified, Joseph of Arimathea cut him down from the cross and saw an image of Christ's face on the cross itself. Nicodemus, who assisted in this proceeding, apparently either snagged or more likely had a copy made of the original. The figure then is said to have disappeared for many centuries until it was unearthed by a holy man, and this would have increased its sales value to whoever actually bought it, named Bishop Gualfredo, who disappears from history after that discovery. He was guided, it is said, by a revelatory dream. The image is said to have first been carried to the Tuscan of Luni in a boat that didn't have any sails or crew. There it stayed until it arrived in Lucca around 742 or perhaps 782 AD. Radiocarbon dating of both the wood and the canvas places the creation of this piece between 770 and 880 AD, off by at least 7 centuries from what is claimed. Lucca had a long history of trading all over the Mediterranean, so it's possible a Lucan wanderer had wandered far enough to find it. This art is clearly ancient, but it was created for the relic trade. This is the Guinigi Tower. It's part of a medieval palazzo of the same name. Aside from being tall and making a great landmark, what it's best known for is the oak trees growing along the top. I wonder how big the authorities are going to let them get. They were mostly leafed out when I visited, as you can see in this photograph. Italian cities often have more than just one bell tower. We just saw the Guinigi Tower, which was part of a medieval palazzo. There are also civic towers. This one, called the Clock Tower, dates from 1390 and has a staircase that'll take you to the top for what must be fabulous views. No elevator, just steps, so I took a pass. There was quite a line of young people waiting to enter and presumably climb. Nearby and in the streets radiating off the piazza are what amounts to a high-end shopping center. Rolex, Prada, and others were represented. None of it looked inexpensive. There's a story behind the steps inside the tower called The Legend of Lucinda and the Devil, which I quite liked. The story goes like this. A beautiful young woman named Lucinda wanted to stay young and beautiful forever. That wouldn't be possible, even with modern plastic surgery, so she cut a deal with the devil. Details don't agree, but in the end, her time was up, and she knew the devil was going to come calling in the debt. Lucinda rushed up the steps thinking that if she stopped the clock, her time wouldn't be up, at least not yet, but she was wrong. When the deal ran out, Lucinda was fetched by the devil himself, who dragged her down the steps, through the entire city on a burning chariot, and dumped her into a lake. Locals say if you stare into the named pond, the reflection of the late Lucinda will glare right back at you. About the middle of the day, perhaps a little bit earlier, I needed a quiet place to sit down, have some lunch, and gather up my thoughts and plan for the afternoon. I had really wanted to visit the Giglio Theater. The original building dated from 1675, but like so many buildings of that era, burned to the ground and had to be rebuilt. The new theater, represented by this classical-style facade, was built here in 1818 by Giovanni Lazzarini. The name Giglio means lily and comes from the fleur-de-lis emblem that was part of the Bourbon heraldic shield of the reigning Duchess Maria Louisa of the House of Bourbon. With a history like that, I really wanted to see the inside, but of course when I trudged past, it was closed. You can see part of the facade of the theater peeping out on the right side of the photograph of the square. I repaired to the Astra Bar restaurant. It might not look like much from the outside, but I have to tell you this place had it where it counted, in the kitchen, the bar, and the heart of its employees. I have to own up, this wasn't my first venue choice. At the first I was driven away by the smokers. Smoking in restaurants was still permissible, and we were outside, and the obnoxious noise they were making. All I wanted was a place to sit quietly and eat my meal in peace. The place wasn't busy when I arrived, so I chatted with the lovely young server. Her name was Martina, and she asked me if I was traveling alone, which seemed quite unusual to her. I told her that my husband was no longer able to travel, and specifically mentioned how he was at home waiting for the details and that I would be communicating the details of the meal to him. And here are those details. Martina was a combination seating hostess, waiter, and barkeeper. She mixed me up a competent Negroni served with quite enough ice. I had heard of Negronis before, but had never had one until that day. I rather liked it, but if I'm honest, at home I generally mix up a Boulevardier, which is the same thing except with bourbon instead of gin. First course was zuppa toscana, which is a kind of Italian bean soup, this time with cannellini, chickpeas, lentils, and barley, which also tends to thicken it, in a broth with some sort of meat I wasn't able to identify. They serve it with toasted mini croutons, which I thought added a nice visual and textural touch. The main dish was eggplant parmesan, and it was pretty good. As you can see, I dug in before I had the presence of mind to take a photograph. I checked back to make sure the restaurant was still in business, and it seems that they are, and it gets great reviews. I'm glad they survived the pandemic. Thank you for joining me for this walk through Lucca, Italy. Come back next time for another adventure with me here on The Armchair Traveler.